Hello everybody, and welcome to Lecture 4. So, the aims for today. We're going to have a look at the arguments for and against the use of ethical codes as a way of regulating the conduct and behaviour of social workers and other professionals, and also to look at the ways in which international and national professional accreditations promote the professional identity of social work and human services. Now, it sounds a little bit dry, but when you actually think of what we're going to talk about, in real life terms and real life examples, you'll see how relevant it is and how important it is to get this under your belt very early on in your studies. So we're going to have a look at exploring the regulation or registration of social work, because at the moment in Australia, social workers don't have to be registered. And we're also going to look a little bit at some different countries and the cultural context, and have a look at some of those emerging issues for ethical practice in the context of advances in technology and online communications. Now that all sounds quite big, but we're just going to talk through it, and it's really, as I said, it's that foundation, and it's really good to get your head around this now, because these concepts will spark a lot of discussion and a lot of ideas for your assignments as you go through this course and indeed the rest of your degree. So, as I'm sure you can imagine, it's really important to determine what is acceptable behaviour and conduct for practitioners as they interact with clients, groups and communities. So, especially with regards to social workers using ourselves as that resource, right down to how much do we share with a client? What do we tell them about ourselves? Do we talk if we have a shared experience? What if you live in the same town, if it's a small town? So many different practical aspects come under this, as well as the much more complex practice issues. So what we're saying is that quality practice is the basis of practice standards, codes of conduct and ethical codes. So looking at codes of ethics to start with. Codes of ethics articulate the social work profession and social workers' values and ethical principles. They offer guidance to social workers to address ethical issues. They protect consumers from incompetent practice and delineate standards for ethical practice. They provide a mechanism for self-governance and protect social workers from ethics complaints and litigation. So it really helps social workers be accountable, because social workers need to be accountable to themselves, to their profession, to the organisation they're working for, to their clients, to government, to communities. So there's so many different layers. We really need something solid, to hang our practice on. But obviously, I guess that sounds fairly self-evident, but when you think of some of the complexities of what happens when you have an issue, one example that I remember, it really colours my practice, because it happened actually before I became a social worker. I was working in the social work department, but I wasn't yet a social worker and hadn't undergone my social work training. So I was working in an inclusion programme, so it's really that time with communities of practice. We're out in the community. We were trying to break down physical and structural barriers for people with disabilities. And I was out in the community one day with a lady that I'll call Jill. So Jill had a cognitive disability or an intellectual impairment, and then had a stroke. So she was using a wheelchair, and with the stroke I think had come sort of increased cognitive impairment as well. She had been very active. She'd been in a soccer team. She was used to running around. She found it very frustrating to have to use a wheelchair. She also came from a background of generational poverty, possibly inappropriate care, paternalistic care, domestic violence. So it was quite a complex situation that she was living in. Anyway, we were out on the street one day, and she had an epileptic seizure. So ambulance was called. The medics assumed, because of the level of disability, that I was a nurse, I think. So anyway, we ended up in the emergency department. I ended up in there with her as they're using the defibrillator. And after the second attempt, the doctor turned to me and said, it's your call. Shall we keep going? What's our quality of life? And that just really impressed on me then and there the need for real clarity and precision in what we do. It also highlighted for me the difference of priorities of different professions, because quality of life, resources, it's a different way to look at disability. And in that moment, a lot of my social work practice crystallised, and I realised the necessity for practice standards, codes of ethics, etc., etc. So, anyway, complexities of ethical codes can lack clarity and precision, and ideally, they're there to help inform decisions, but they're not always clear in telling you what you should do. Hence, having ethical decision-making frameworks that we touched on briefly before. They're designed to protect workers more than clients. You can have conflicts emerging with and between codes, so I guess there was a difference between professional codes in that situation I was describing. They can be reactive rather than proactive. They need to be adapted to different cultures, and there might not be professional consensus on what is ethical conduct. So the international context, the International Federation of Social Workers, IFSW. Good to Google them, keep them on your favourite tabs, because it's just good to keep an eye on what's happening. This was formed in 1956, represents social workers from 84 countries with over 470,000 members. They define social work, and in fact I was in Melbourne at the International Conference a few years ago when they were ratifying the updated definition, which for me, being maybe a little bit sad, I thought that was quite exciting. And the IFSW also have a statement of ethical principles and general guidelines for professional conduct. And if you are fortunate to be where the IFSW meets, some of those cultural debates are really rich in terms of, one, identifying the similarity of social workers all over the world, but two, really getting to grips with those different cultural contexts. So the IFSW have policy statements on the following, and sometimes when I read that through very quickly, I think, yeah, that really highlights the global nature of social work. You know, if you're looking at genocide, cross-border issues, refugees, migration, but then when you read it again with an Australian head-on, Australia has displaced persons, there's issues from globalisation and the environment, health, HIV/AIDS, human rights, Indigenous people, migration, ageing and older adults, peace and social justice, protection of personal information, refugees, rural communities, women, youth, cross-border reproductive technologies, genocide, well, fairly recently in history, yes, working environments, poverty eradication, people with disabilities. So it's interesting sometimes, I think, to think of it from a sort of local, perhaps a national perspective, and also that global perspective as well, and just start to think of similarities and differences and what might apply. I mean, just on the radio the other day, there was a big argument about choosing the sex, I think for IVF, choosing the sex of the child, which had just, the ban on that has been continued, but there's a lot of argument for, because other countries don't have the same ban. So yeah, just interesting. Just to keep an eye on what's going on. Okay, so moving a little bit closer to home, we've got the Australian Association of Social Workers, which was founded in the 1940s and has 6,000 members. It is voluntary, so it's a voluntary professional association funded through membership fees. It has a board of directors with state territory branches, so the Queensland branch is very active, very good to be involved if you can, or whichever state you're living in. And it has a national committee for ethics, social policy, registration, education, international qualifications, and CPD. And I have been through the National Committee for International Qualifications because I studied my social work at Edinburgh University. And from that experience, I would highly recommend that you join as a student member because, one, it's a lot cheaper Two, you really can get to grips with all of the wonderful resources they have on their website and then decide if it's for you or not. And three, if you have been a member of a professional association, it's so much easier to translate your qualification if you want to work overseas. So for me, having been a member of the SSSC in Scotland, that meant it was a lot easier for me to become a member of the AASW once my qualifications were ratified. So the Great Regulation Debate. As I said earlier, social work in Australia is not yet regulated, and there is a big discussion about that. And so the AASW are continuing to pursue statutory regulation and looking at sort of harm, practice issues, all those different types of things. So there is a current system of self-regulation, but only members of the AASW can be investigated for ethical breaches. So there's some quite polarised views around this, because those in favour of registration argue status and identity would significantly increase, and social work would be seen as a much more sort of like professional profession, as it were. And then there's those against that argue that social work should remain unfettered by government. So it's, I think when you first think about this, it sometimes, for a lot of people, it's like, well, of course we should be regulated, absolutely. But just if you have a think about it, so what is your position on whether the AASW should continue to pursue statutory regulation of social work? I mean, what do you think are the potential advantages and disadvantages for individual social workers? And what are the pros and cons for registration of the profession as a whole? And should there be one body that acts as a representative entity for all people employed in social work and human services? And I think one of the arguments is sort of, if we look at it philosophically, yes, regulation could be seen to be a good thing. Yes, it's good because it promotes ethical practice. But who mandates what that is? Is it the government? If it is the government who funds the AASW, then does that restrict some of the freedom of ideas and concepts? If it's the AASW, how is that regulated? And then when you think of individual social workers who may be in breach of the Code of Ethics, social workers are working in areas that aren't always supported by governments and structures, and quite often are challenging structures. So there are quite a few grey areas within how it would be managed. So it's just worth having a bit of a think around some of those issues as you think about it. I would recommend that there is a big, there are quite a lot of forums on the discussion board where we discuss this, and usually people have some wonderful ideas, and it's really good to share your thoughts there. But also go onto the AASW website and have a bit of a look around and see what you think. Okay, so practice standards for social workers. So standards are a guide to practice, a basis for standardisation of practice, quality guarantee, set expectations, look at issues of accountability. They're a benchmark for assessment of practice, and they're a guide for planning ongoing professional development. So, these are the areas that are covered in the AASW practice standards. So, values and ethics, professionalism, culturally responsive and inclusive practice, knowledge for practice, application of knowledge to practice, communication and interpersonal skills, information recording and sharing, and professional development and supervision. So this is a little bit of a history about how it all sort of worked. Don't worry about this too much. So we've got the National Ethics Framework. So there was a major review of ethics management in 2006. A new framework was put in place in 2007 with the employment of an ethics officer. There's a revised ethics complaint management process, an ethics education and policy development, National Ethics Group, and National Ethics Consultation Service. And then the review of the AASW Code of Ethics. The last revision was in 1999, and the new code was launched in 2010 following a significant review and consultation process. And hang on to this, this is really important. The 3 core social work values are respect for persons, social justice, and professional integrity. So, if you just have a pause and think, I know when I look at that, the one that jumps out for me is social justice. And I think professional integrity is a social work value, but then thinking about what that means when we use ourself in social work and we work with people, it's actually exceedingly complex and exceedingly important. Right, so the content of the AASW Code of Ethics 2010. General ethical responsibilities. And as we talked earlier, remember about accountability, so responsibility is another word for accountabilities in a way. So thinking about responsibilities to our clients, to our profession, to our colleagues, in different contexts, for example, education, training, supervision and evaluation, research, self-employment, remote service delivery, and responsibilities in the workplace, service provision and management. And there is also the Australian College of Social Work. Now, this was established to recognise and promote advanced social work practice and provide leadership in practice excellence. So the aim of the college is to recognise and acknowledge the highest professional standards and qualifications that social workers offer. So it's really a way to extend the AASW's focus on high quality professional service delivery across all the different fields of practice of social work. And now looking to the Aotearoa New Zealand Association of Social Workers, that was formed in 1964 to promote the interests of social workers. And that features a promotion of bicultural practice. It has a code of ethics and practice standards, and they are very similar to the AASW. It also has a social work registration board, but at the moment not all workers are required to be registered. And then looking around at the other associations that we might come across, or in fact you might even be a member of. There's the Australian Register of Counsellors and Psychotherapists, so ARCAP. That's a voluntary self-regulation model. So ACA and PACFA, joint agreement, and has a single national credentialing system. And it also has codes of ethics and standards of practice for counsellors and therapists. And then another one that's very, very widely used within the human service workers and social welfare workers, the Australian Community Workers Association, ACWA. That was formed in 1969 to represent a range of human service and community sector workers. It has a broad range of membership, and at the moment that's not moving to formally pursue registration. However, it does accredit degrees, so you can have a degree that is ACWA accredited. So looking at harmful practice, very briefly, there is harmful practice in human services in across many different fields of practice. If you look at the literature on sexual boundary violations, that shows where the potential is for serious harm, well, one example of the potential for serious harm. But it also highlights some of the issues, because I remember once working in residential care, and one of my workers had come back from the shops, and I was like, oh, what were you doing at the shops, you know, blah, 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 working time, da-da. He said, oh, I was just buying some stuff for, let's call him John. I said, oh, what did you get? And he said, oh, I got all of these magazines. And I was like, okay, And John used a wheelchair and was unable to go and access pornography, which was on the top shelf at the newsagent, so the worker had gone to buy some for him. And I guess it's just those discussions that are really, really important. And nowadays I feel old sometimes, sorry. Conversations are more open, and we have more discussions about what is okay and what's not okay, but there's still an awful lot of grey areas, and there's still a lot of grey areas where we might have some conflict with our personal values as well. So that's why having these systems and structures in place is so important. And that's why we can identify that there are concerns about the lack of regulation for many people who work in social work and human services. And then not only do we have the actual physical practice, but we have our e-professionalism as well. So just very, very briefly, it's just one to just keep in the back of your mind. There's an awful lot of ethical conflicts about e-professionalism and our online professional persona. There's privacy issues, risk to our professional reputation, but on the plus side, there's opportunities for advocacy, employment, training, disseminating information. And there's that whole, with everything being available online and everything starting to link up, what do you put up there and how do you actually separate out the personal from the professional? And where are the links when, you know, a client that's become very close to you starts to look for you online? What's your footprint online? What does it look like? What does it say about you? And then we go to remote service delivery, which, you know, we've got so many options when we use online. We've got e-therapy, cyber groups, web-based interventions. So it's really, this is just a flag, you know, to start thinking about this. And I would actually encourage you to go to the Canadian Association of Social Workers. If you just go into the search engine and look up Canadian Association of Social Workers. And on their sort of front page, they've got some tabs along the top. And if you look at resources, and down near the bottom there, I think it is, they've got social media use and social work practice. So it's actually quite a well thought through document on how social media and social work practice integrate or interrelate. And I would just highly recommend that you just have a little bit of a look at that, or even download it, keep it in your favourites, and it's just something else to refer to as we go along. Okay, I think we're just about finished. So, we've started to look at some of those debates around professionalism and regulation, having a look at practice standards and ethical codes, and very, very briefly, a little bit about digital technology, online identity, and remote service. Okay, thank you once again, and I'll talk to you shortly.